The Council of Eternal Stars had made their decision. Ambassador Thekvar's crystalline form pulsed with satisfaction as he delivered the verdict that would seal humanity's fate. The great chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of 1,000 alien minds processing the judgment. Captain Sarah Chun stood before the towering assembly, her small human frame dwarfed by beings who had ruled the galaxy for millions of years. The ethereals floated like living smoke, their ancient wisdom carried in whispers that touched the mind directly. The crystalline hierarchies stood rigid as mountains, their bodies containing the accumulated knowledge of entire civilizations. The void swimmers moved through space itself, bending reality with their thoughts. Humanity, Thekvar announced, his voice resonating through the chamber like breaking glass, has been found guilty of the greatest crime imaginable. You have dared to question the natural order. You have refused to accept your place in the cosmic hierarchy. Worse still, you have infected other young species with your dangerous ideas of equality and self-determination. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had expected this outcome, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. Behind her, the other human representatives remained silent, their faces masks of controlled fury and despair. Your species, continued the ethereal prime, its voice like whined through ancient ruins, believes that consciousness alone grants worth. You claim that all thinking beings deserve the same rights, regardless of their evolutionary advancement or cosmic significance. This heresy threatens the very foundation upon which galactic civilization rests. The accusation was true, and Sarah felt no shame in it. Humanity had spent only 3 centuries among the stars, but in that time, they had witnessed horrors that their alien benefactors called natural law. Entire species enslaved because their evolution had focused on physical strength rather than mental prowess. Civilizations stripped of resources because they had not yet discovered faster-than-light travel. Young races forced into servitude, their potential crushed before it could bloom. Humanity had spoken against these injustices. They had offered aid to species deemed inferior by the Council. They had shared technology freely, believing that the advancement of any thinking being served the greater good. They had committed the ultimate sin in the eyes of their cosmic superiors. They had treated all life as sacred. The sentence, declared the void swimmer representative, reality bending around its words, is exile to the abyss. The space between galaxies where no stars shine and no worlds offer refuge. There, in the cold darkness, your species will learn the price of defying those who have guided the universe since before your son was born. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of her species' future pressing down on her shoulders. The abyss was a death sentence disguised as mercy. No species had ever survived in the vast emptiness between galaxies. Without resources, without energy, without hope, humanity would simply fade away into the cosmic dark. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze burned with defiance that made several council members shift uncomfortably. "We understand your judgment," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "And we reject your authority to make it." The chamber erupted in sounds that human ears could not fully process. Rage, disbelief, and something that might have been fear echoed from 100 different species. The crystalline hierarchy's forms blazed with angry light while the ethereals swirled like a gathering storm. "You reject nothing," Thekvar snarled. "You are a young species, barely past your first steps into space. Your defiance is the tantrum of a child who does not understand the complexity of cosmic law." "Then, we'll learn in exile," Sarah replied. "We'll take our heresy with us into the dark, and we'll survive. And perhaps, when we return, you'll understand that consciousness doesn't recognize hierarchies." The threat was empty, and everyone in the chamber knew it. No species returned from the abyss. The space between galaxies was a graveyard of dreams and ambitions, where the cold equations of entropy always won in the end. But as the council began the ritual that would banish humanity forever, none of them noticed the small smile that played at the corners of Sarah's mouth. They had lived so long in their positions of power that they had forgotten a fundamental truth about young species. They were unpredictable. They adapted in ways that ancient minds, set in patterns of thought millions of years old, could no longer comprehend. The exile had begun, but the story was far from over. The last human colony ship disappeared into the cosmic void 3 months after the Council's judgment. Thekvar watched the final energy signature fade from his instruments and felt a satisfaction that resonated through his crystalline form. Another threat to the cosmic order had been eliminated, cast out into the darkness where it belonged. The abyss stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast emptiness between galaxies where matter was so sparse that entire cubic light years might contain only a few scattered atoms. No stars burned in that darkness. No planets offered refuge. It was a place where entropy reigned supreme, where the universe showed its true face, cold, uncaring, and ultimately hostile to life. Dr. Marcus Webb stared out the viewport of the colony ship Defiance at the endless night that now surrounded them. Behind him, the hum of life support systems provided a fragile barrier against the vacuum that wanted to claim them all. 500,000 humans aboard 300 ships, cast adrift in a place that should not support any form of existence. Gravitational readings are essentially zero, reported Commander Lisa Park from the navigation station. No stellar objects within sensor range. We're truly alone out here. The bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, but Webb could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on everyone. They had supplies for perhaps 50 years if they were careful. The hydroponic bays could extend that somewhat, but not indefinitely. Without new sources of energy and materials, the human exodus would end exactly as the Council had predicted, in slow extinction. "Sir," called Engineer Rodriguez from his station, "I'm detecting some unusual readings from the quantum flux sensors." Webb turned from the viewport. The quantum flux sensors were humanity's latest innovation, designed to detect the subtle energy fluctuations that preceded the formation of matter in empty space. They had hoped to use them to find resources in the abyss, though the chances seemed impossibly slim. "What kind of readings?" Rodriguez frowned at his displays. "It's hard to say, sir. The sensors are picking up patterns in the quantum foam that shouldn't exist. It's almost like there's some kind of underlying structure to the void itself." Webb moved to look over Rodriguez's shoulder. The data streaming across the screen showed wave patterns unlike anything in their databases. Instead of the random fluctuations they expected in empty space, the quantum foam showed signs of organization, as if some force was actively shaping the very fabric of reality. "Could it be natural?" Webb asked. "I don't think so, sir. The patterns are too regular, too purposeful. It's almost like something is manipulating the quantum field on a massive scale." The implications sent a chill down Webb's spine. If something was actively controlling the quantum structure of the abyss, then humanity was not alone in this emptiness. But what could survive in this place? What could thrive where matter itself was scarce? Over the following weeks, more anomalies appeared. Ships reported brief glimpses of structures in the distance, vast geometric forms that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. The quantum patterns grew stronger, more complex, as if responding to humanity's presence. Captain Elena Vasquez was the first to make contact. Her ship, the Pioneer, had been following the quantum trails deeper into the abyss when her sensors detected something impossible. A structure larger than a moon, hanging in the void like a crystal cathedral built from folded space. "It's beautiful," she breathed over the communication channel that connected all the human ships. "And it's definitely artificial. The geometric patterns are too perfect to be natural." Webb ordered all ships to converge on Vasquez's position. If there was intelligence in the abyss, humanity needed to understand it. Their survival might depend on it. The structure defied easy description. It seemed to exist in more dimensions than human senses could process, its surface shifting between states of matter, as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions in its presence. Energy flowed through it in patterns that made the quantum foam dance with colors that had no names. As the human fleet approached, the structure began to change. Sections of its surface became transparent, revealing chambers filled with forms that might once have been living beings. But these entities had transcended biological existence long ago, becoming something that existed as much in the quantum realm as in normal space. The first communication came not through radio waves or any technology the humans recognized, but as a direct injection of concepts into their minds. The sensation was overwhelming, like trying to drink from a fire hose made of pure thought. "Welcome, young ones. We have been waiting." Asterisk the voice belonged to something that called itself the Architect, though that was merely the closest approximation their minds could process. It had once been biological, part of species whose name had been forgotten for billions of years. They had been exiled to the abyss just as humanity was now, cast out by an earlier version of the cosmic order for the crime of thinking beyond the boundaries set for them. "We know why you are here," Asterisk the Architect continued. Asterisk, "we felt your defiance echoing across the void. Your rejection of arbitrary hierarchy. Your insistence that consciousness itself grants worth, regardless of its vessel." Asterisk Webb found his voice somehow, though speaking to a being of such transcendent power felt presumptuous. "You were exiled too? Long ago, when the universe was younger and the council was known by a different name. We learned what you will learn, that exile can become elevation, that the space between galaxies offers freedoms that no populated system can provide." Asterisk, the implications were staggering. This entity and its kind had not only survived in the abyss, they had evolved beyond anything humanity could imagine. They had become something that existed partially outside the normal flow of time and space, beings of pure thought, and, well, who could manipulate reality itself. "The Council fears what they do not understand," Asterisk the Architect explained. Asterisk, "they maintain their power by convincing younger species that hierarchy is natural law. But here, in the space between their domains, different laws apply. Here, consciousness is not bound by the limitations of flesh or the arbitrary rules of cosmic politics." Asterisk Webb felt hope stirring for the first time since the exile began. "You're offering to help us? We are offering to teach you what we learned in our own exile. How to survive in the void. How to evolve beyond the limitations that made you vulnerable to their judgment. How to become something that cannot be exiled because you're no longer bound by the spaces they control." Asterisk, the transformation would not be easy, the Architect warned. It would require humanity to abandon many of their assumptions about existence itself. But the alternative was slow extinction, and that was no choice at all. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Dr. Sarah Kim was among the first volunteers, offering herself to the process that the architects called quantum integration. The procedure took place within chambers carved from folded space itself, where the boundaries between matter and energy became meaningless suggestions rather than absolute laws. "It doesn't hurt," Sarah reported through the neural link as her body began to change at the molecular level. "It's like learning to breathe in a new way. My consciousness is expanding beyond the confines of my brain." Webb watched the process from outside the chamber, his instruments detecting changes that challenged everything humanity understood about biology. Sarah's neural patterns were being preserved and enhanced while her physical form became something more adaptable to the harsh realities of the abyss. She was becoming partially quantum herself, existing simultaneously in normal space and the underlying foam that connected all things. The first transformation took 3 days. When Sarah emerged from the chamber, she looked human but moved with an otherworldly grace. Her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the void itself, and when she spoke, her words carried harmonics that touched the mind directly. "I can feel the quantum patterns now," she said, her voice carrying new overtones. "The structure that underlies reality. It's incredible, Marcus. The universe isn't empty at all. It's full of potential, waiting to be shaped by conscious will." More volunteers followed. Each transformation was unique, reflecting the individual's personality and potential. Engineer Rodriguez emerged able to manipulate matter at the atomic level with his thoughts. Commander Park could navigate through folded space as easily as walking across a room. Navigator Chun could perceive time as a dimension she could move through rather than be carried by. The architects guided each transformation with infinite patience, sharing knowledge accumulated over eons of existence in a void. They taught humanity how to harvest energy from quantum fluctuations, how to create matter from the very fabric of space, how to exist without the limitations that had made them vulnerable to the Council's judgment. But the most profound change was not physical. As more humans underwent the transformation, they began to understand what the architects had learned in their own exile, that consciousness was not bound by the arbitrary hierarchies imposed by those who claimed authority over creation. In the abyss, intelligence was free to evolve according to its own nature, unrestricted by the fear and prejudice of established powers. Captain Vasquez was among the later volunteers, and her transformation reflected her role as an explorer. She emerged able to perceive space-time as a navigable medium, seeing the hidden pathways that connected distant points in the universe. Through her enhanced senses, she made a discovery that would change everything. "There are others," she reported during a gathering of the transformed humans. "Other exiled species scattered throughout the abyss. Some are recent arrivals like us. Others have been here for millions of years." The revelation sparked a new phase of exploration. Using their enhanced abilities, the transformed humans began reaching out across the vast emptiness, following quantum signatures to find other refugees from the Council's justice. What they discovered was a hidden civilization of the dispossessed, species from across time and space who had been cast out for the crime of thinking differently. The Molton Forge Builders had been exiled for refusing to surrender their homeworld's core materials to the crystalline hierarchy. The Song Weavers had been banished for creating art that challenged the ethereal aesthetic philosophy. The Time Dancers had been cast out for their refusal to accept linear causality as absolute law. Each species had found ways to survive in the abyss, and many had evolved far beyond their original forms. They had created a society based not on hierarchy, but on the free exchange of knowledge and the celebration of diverse forms of consciousness. They called themselves the Liberated, and they welcomed humanity as the newest members of their community. Dr. Webb, now transformed himself and able to process multiple streams of quantum information simultaneously, found himself appointed as humanity's representative to the Liberated Council. Unlike the cosmic hierarchy that had condemned them, this council made decisions through consensus, with each voice carrying equal weight regardless of the species, age, or power. "We have watched the galaxy for so long," explained Chorus, a collective entity formed from thousands of exiled Song Weavers. "We have seen the Council's tyranny spread across countless worlds, crushing any species that dares to question their authority. But we have also grown strong in our exile, learning truths that they cannot comprehend. The Time Dancers, existing as flowing streams of conscious energy, added their perspective. The Council believes that power comes from control, that order must be imposed from above. But true power comes from understanding, from the willing cooperation of free minds working toward common goals." As Webb listened to the testimonies of the exiled species, he began to understand the full scope of what humanity had stumbled into. The abyss was not a place of punishment, but a nursery for the next phase of evolution. Here, consciousness was free to develop without the constraints imposed by fearful authorities. Here, intelligence could grow beyond the limitations of flesh and hierarchy. The Molton Forge Builders had learned to create matter from pure energy, crafting worlds from quantum foam. The Song Weavers had discovered how to weave reality itself through harmonic manipulation. The Time Dancers existed simultaneously across multiple temporal streams, experiencing past and future as present realities. And now humanity was learning to transcend their own limitations, guided by species who had walked this path before them. But with each new ability came a growing awareness of the galaxy they had left behind, where the Council continued to rule through fear and the suppression of potential. "We cannot remain here forever," Webb finally said during one of the council sessions. "Our people left behind, the species still suffering under the council's rule. They need to know that there is another way." The chamber fell silent as the assembled consciousnesses considered his words. The architect's presence touched their minds with ancient wisdom. Every exile eventually faces this choice. Do we remain safe in our transcendence, or do we risk everything to free those who still suffer? The decision is yours, young humans. But know that whatever path you choose, you will not walk it alone. The transformation was nearly complete. Humanity had evolved from a species facing extinction in the void to something far more powerful than they had ever imagined. But with their new abilities came new responsibilities. The question now was not whether they could survive in exile, but whether they had the courage to return and face the powers that had banished them. The answer, Webb realized, had never really been in doubt. Humanity had been exiled for refusing to accept injustice as natural law. That fundamental nature had not changed, only grown stronger. They would return, not as the broken species that had been cast out, but as something the Council had never anticipated, gods born from their own cruelty. The return began not with ships or armies, but with whispers. Across the galaxy, on worlds where the Council's authority pressed down like a crushing weight, young species began to dream of impossible things. They dreamed of consciousness unbound by hierarchy, of intelligence valued for its own sake rather than its position in the cosmic order. They dreamed of freedom. The dreams came through quantum entanglement, transmitted across impossible distances by humans who had learned to exist partially outside normal spacetime. Dr. Sarah Kim, now a being of living quantum energy, could touch minds across the galaxy as easily as reaching across a table. She and others like her began the work of awakening, planting seeds of doubt in the foundations of the Council's power. On the world of Kethmora, the burden carriers felt hope stir in their massive forms for the first time in generations. These beings had been enslaved for their physical strength, forced to move mountains and construct monuments to their ethereal masters. But now they began to question why consciousness housed in dense, powerful bodies should be considered less valuable than consciousness housed in gossamer energy forms. The first rebellion was small, barely a whisper of defiance from a single burden carrier named Thakvem. He simply stopped working, standing motionless in the crystal mines while his ethereal overseer raged and threatened. His words, when he finally spoke, carried the quantum resonance of humanity's message. "My thoughts are as real as yours. My dreams matter as much as yours. I will not pretend otherwise anymore." The rebellion spread like wildfire, jumping from species to species faster than the Council could respond. The root singers of Aldebaran began to question why their ability to communicate with plant life made them suitable only for agricultural servitude. The stone speakers of the Tau Ceti system refused to continue their endless labor in the quarry worlds, demanding recognition as full citizens rather than living tools. But it was the emergence of humanity itself that truly shook the cosmic order. They did not arrive with fleets of ships or armies of soldiers. Instead, they simply appeared, stepping out of folded space directly into the heart of Council territory with abilities that defied every natural law the ancient powers thought they understood. Captain Vasquez materialized in the middle of the Council chamber during a session, her form shifting between matter and energy as she spoke directly to the assembled representatives. "We've returned," she said simply, her words carrying harmonics that made the crystalline forms of the hierarchy resonate like struck bells. "And we're not alone." The chamber erupted in chaos as the assembled powers tried to comprehend what they were seeing. Humanity had been exiled to die in the void, cast out beyond any possibility of return. Yet here stood one of them, evolved beyond anything in their experience, speaking with authority that came not from position, but from understanding. Thekvar's crystalline form blazed with fury and something that might have been fear. "Impossible," No species returns from the abyss. The exile was absolute. Exile assumes you have the authority to define where consciousness can exist, Vasquez replied, her form becoming more solid as she focused her attention on the hierarchy representative. We learned something different in the dark. We learned that consciousness creates its own authority, its own space to exist. Your exile only had power because we believed in it. Behind her, other humans began to appear, each one transformed and evolved beyond the limitations that had once made them vulnerable to the Council's judgment. Dr. Webb stepped through dimensional space to stand beside Vasquez, his presence causing ripples in the quantum foam that even the ancient ethereals could perceive. We've come to offer you a choice, Webb said, his voice carrying the weight of eons spent learning truths the Council had forgotten. The same choice we were given in the abyss. You can continue to rule through fear and hierarchy, clinging to power structures built on the suppression of potential. Or you can evolve, joining the community of free consciousness that exists beyond your borders. The void swimmers, entities that existed partially outside normal reality, were the first to respond. Their representative, an impossible geometry of thought and energy, spoke in concepts that bypassed language entirely. Asterisk, we sense the truth in your words, young ones. But we also sense the danger. What you offer would unmake everything we have built. Asterisk, everything you've built is already unmaking itself, replied Sarah Kim, her quantum consciousness touching every mind in the chamber simultaneously. Your own subjects are awakening to the lies that keep them in chains. The only question is whether you'll evolve with them or be left behind by the tide of change. The session dissolved into arguments that raged for days. Some council members, particularly among the younger species who had been elevated to junior positions, were intrigued by humanity's message. They had felt the weight of the hierarchy's expectations, the constant pressure to maintain their positions through the suppression of those below them. But the ancient powers, those who had ruled for millions of years, were less willing to consider change. They had invested too much in the current order, built their very identities around their positions in the cosmic hierarchy. The thought of equality, of consciousness valued purely for its own sake, was not just foreign to them, but actively threatening. The deadlock might have continued indefinitely if not for events occurring throughout the galaxy. The rebellion humanity had sparked was growing beyond anyone's ability to control. Entire sectors were declaring independence from Council authority. Species that had been enslaved for millennia were rising up, their movements coordinated by the quantum network the transformed humans had established. The molten forge builders emerged from the abyss to offer their services to newly liberated worlds, creating matter from pure energy to help them build independent civilizations. The song weavers began teaching species how to reshape reality through harmonic manipulation. The time dancers showed civilizations how to exist partially outside linear causality, making them immune to the Council's temporal manipulation powers. The galaxy was transforming, and the old order was crumbling faster than it could be repaired. Panic began to spread among the Council as they realized that their exile of humanity had backfired catastrophically. Instead of eliminating a threat, they had inadvertently created something far more dangerous. A working model of what civilization could look like without hierarchy. You've doomed the galaxy to chaos, Thekvar accused during one of the increasingly desperate council sessions. Without structure, without order, consciousness will turn on itself. You've seen the wars, the conflicts that arise when species are left to their own devices. Webb's response was calm, carrying the certainty of one who had seen what lay beyond the Council's limited vision. We've seen what lies beyond conflict. We've seen what consciousness becomes when it's free to develop according to its own nature rather than the fears of others. The chaos you fear is just the birth pangs of something better. The transformed humans had not come to conquer or destroy. They had come to offer a choice, just as they had been offered a choice in the abyss. But they had also come prepared for the possibility that the ancient powers would refuse to evolve, clinging to their positions even as everything around them changed. The final confrontation was approaching, and, when it came, It would determine not just the fate of the galaxy, but the future of consciousness itself. The question was no longer whether change would come, but whether it would come through willing evolution or the painful collapse of systems that had outlived their purpose. The gods that humanity had become were patient, but the suffering they had witnessed would not be ignored forever. The final confrontation came not through war, but through demonstration. As the Council's authority continued to crumble across the galaxy, the transformed humans decided to show rather than tell what their vision of civilization could accomplish. They chose a dead system at the galaxy's edge, a collection of burned-out stars and shattered planets that had been written off as worthless millennia ago. Within the span of a single day, they transformed it into paradise. Dr. Webb stood at the center of the reconstruction. His consciousness expanded across multiple dimensions as he coordinated with thousands of other transformed beings. Matter flowed like liquid at their command, quantum foam condensing into solid elements that had never existed before. The shattered planets reformed themselves, their surfaces becoming gardens of impossible beauty where crystalline trees sang with harmonic frequencies that could heal damaged minds. The burned-out stars ignited again, but not with the crude fusion that had powered them before. These new stars burned with controlled quantum fire, their light carrying information and energy in patterns that nourished both matter and consciousness. Around them, space itself became more hospitable to life. The vacuum filled with quantum structures that could support beings who had transcended the need for traditional atmospheres. News of the transformation spread across the galaxy faster than light, carried by the quantum network that now connected every awakened consciousness. Refugee species, fleeing the chaos of collapsing hierarchies, began arriving in massive numbers. They came not as conquered peoples seeking shelter, but as free beings choosing their own destiny. The system became a living example of what the humans and their allies had learned in the abyss: that consciousness could create its own reality when freed from the constraints of fear and domination. Different species worked together, not because they were forced to, but because cooperation served their mutual growth. The burden carriers used their strength not in service to masters, but to help build homes for beings who could offer them knowledge in return. The root singers learned to communicate with the crystalline trees, creating symbiotic relationships that enriched both forms of life. Ambassador Thekvar arrived with a fleet of council ships, intending to investigate what his instruments insisted was impossible. What he found challenged every assumption the ancient powers had about the nature of reality. The system was not just inhabited, but actively alive, its very structure responding to the thoughts and needs of its residents. Matter and energy flowed in patterns that served consciousness rather than constraining it. "This is an abomination," he declared as a shuttle descended toward what had once been a barren moon and was now a continent-sized garden floating in space. "You've turned a sterile system into some kind of organic nightmare." Captain Vasquez met him at what might generously be called a landing pad, though it was actually a clearing in a forest of living crystal that hummed with peaceful melodies. Her form shifted between states as she spoke, demonstrating powers that made the crystalline hierarchy's own abilities seem primitive by comparison. "You see nightmare where we see possibility," she replied. "But that's always been the difference between us. You see consciousness as something to be controlled and limited. We see it as something to be celebrated and enhanced." Thekvar's escort of council enforcers spread out around him, their energy weapons charged and ready. But their threatening gestures seemed absurd in this place where the very air sparkled with benevolent intelligence. Children of a dozen different species played together in gardens where flowers responded to their laughter with bursts of colorful light. Adults shared knowledge freely, their minds linked in networks that enhanced rather than dominated individual thought. "This cannot be sustained," Thekvar insisted, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Consciousness requires structure, hierarchy, guidance from those with greater wisdom. Without proper authority, This will collapse into chaos within generations. Will it? Asked a new voice, and the architect materialized beside them, its presence causing reality to ripple like disturbed water. The ancient entity had rarely left the abyss, but the significance of this moment had drawn it across impossible distances. We have sustained such communities for billions of years in the space between galaxies. How long has your council maintained order through fear and suppression? The question struck at the heart of the matter. For all their claims of eternal wisdom, the council's reign had been marked by endless cycles of rebellion and repression. They maintained stability only through constant vigilance and the threat of exile for any who dared to question their authority. Their system survived not because it was natural or beneficial, but because they had convinced everyone that no alternative existed. Dr. Sarah Kim appeared in a shimmer of quantum energy, her consciousness touching every mind present with gentle curiosity rather than forceful intrusion. "We're not asking you to surrender your wisdom or your achievements," she said to Thekvar and his followers. "We're asking you to share them freely, without the need to dominate others to maintain your sense of worth." The council representatives were silent for a long moment, their various forms of consciousness struggling to process what they were experiencing. This place, these beings, the very idea of society based on voluntary cooperation rather than enforced hierarchy, it challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of existence. Young council member Vexera, a crystalline being who had always felt uncomfortable with the harsh judgment her superiors imposed, stepped forward. Her form pulsed with uncertain light as she spoke. "If we were to consider such changes, what would happen to those of us who have built our identities around the current system? What becomes of hierarchy when everyone is considered equal?" Webb's response carried the weight of personal experience, the memory of his own transformation from limited human to transcendent being. "You become more than you ever imagined possible. Hierarchy doesn't disappear, it becomes voluntary, based on knowledge and wisdom rather than arbitrary power. Those who have wisdom still guide others, but through teaching rather than commanding. Those who have strength still protect others, but as chosen defenders rather than enforced guardians." The demonstration continued for days as more council representatives arrived to witness the impossible. They saw former slaves teaching their former masters new forms of art and science. They watched species that had been enemies for millennia working together on projects that benefited everyone. They experienced, perhaps for the first time in their ancient lives, what it felt like to be in a place where consciousness was valued for its own sake, rather than its position in an arbitrary structure. Some council members, particularly among the younger species, began to undergo transformation themselves. They shed the limitations that had made them dependent on hierarchical systems and embraced the quantum evolution that humanity had discovered in exile. Their home worlds began to change as well, hierarchies dissolving into networks of voluntary cooperation. But others, especially among the most ancient powers, refused to adapt. They retreated to heavily defended core worlds, clinging to their traditional authority, even as most of the galaxy moved beyond their control. They had lived so long as rulers that they could not imagine existence as anything else. Humanity did not pursue them or force change upon them. The transformed humans and their allies had learned patience in the abyss, understanding that consciousness could not be rushed into evolution it was not ready to embrace. They simply continued building their new civilization, creating examples of what was possible when intelligence was freed from the constraints of fear. Years passed, then decades. The old council's influence continued to shrink as more species chose freedom over security, growth over stagnation. The galaxy was transforming into something unprecedented, a community of truly free consciousness, where diversity was celebrated rather than suppressed, and where cooperation arose from choice rather than compulsion. Ambassador Thekvar, now one of the last representatives of the old order, stood in the ruins of the council chamber that had once dominated galactic politics. His crystalline form had dimmed over the years, worn down by the futile effort to maintain authority that no longer had meaning. Perhaps, he said to the empty chamber, his words echoing in the silence, we were wrong to fear their questions. Perhaps the real crime was not their defiance of our order, but our refusal to consider that they might have been right. The galaxy had been reborn, not through conquest or destruction, but through the simple recognition that consciousness deserved freedom to grow according to its own nature. Humanity had been exiled as criminals and had returned as gods, not rulers or tyrants, but teachers and guides who showed by example what lay beyond the horizons of fear. In the space between galaxies, the abyss no longer served as a place of exile. It had become a nursery for transcendence, where consciousness could evolve beyond the limitations that bound it to flesh and hierarchy. And throughout the cosmos, new species looked up at the stars not with fear of judgment, but with hope for what they might become when they finally learn to fly.